One of the activities I always did with my ethics class when I taught high school was trust fall. I'd pair them up, have them lean gently into the partner's hands behind them, and have the partner step back, have them lean further so they at least notice some empty space, and the partner would gently push them back up. And then it got really daunting. Then I'd have them climb up on a stage where the lip of the stage was a good 5 or 6 feet off the floor onto a little podium that was there, put them another foot or 2 up on the edge. And I would have them turn around and fall backwards into a net made by their classmates' interlocking arms. This always got a few gasps. You know, the type of, I ain't doing that. But I would always go first. And having even more girth than I do now, once they saw that they could catch me and I was okay, and how much smaller they were than I was, it got people to try. There was always a few students in every class, every year I did this, that would jump right up to go after me. Jostling each other to see who'd be the first to fall. And there were always a very shy, more intimidated few who waited to the very end, hoping we'd run out of time, but we didn't because we just continued it class to class, day to day, till everyone at least tried, who just wanted to go last or didn't want to go. And we had to really talk them into trying. All of us, their classmates and me, just to give it a shot. When the activity was finally over, we talked about trust, how we build trust, how encouragement helps more than making fun of people who might be scared. And we also talked about who the bravest was, who the bravest people were in the activity. And they named me, because I went first. And they named the few students who would always jump up right away to go after me. But I'd tell them that no, not me and your classmates who jumped up right away, we weren't brave because we weren't scared. The classmates who appeared bold and fearless weren't showing much courage. It didn't scare them. The people who were really brave were those more intimidated few who waited to the end and had to find something deep inside them to try. Those people were incredibly courageous. Courage isn't about being fearless or being bold. It's about overcoming fear and getting on with it anyway. The difference between courage and fearlessness occurred to me as I was preparing this sermon when Alex Carbo sent his drawing for the cover. So his drawing for the cover, his task was to help me illustrate courage. It's Captain America. And I came up with this because I, like him, am a big comic book fan from way back. So I was like, great, superheroes. What's braver and more courageous than superheroes? But then it occurred to me, they have superpowers. It's a lot easier to be brave and fearless and bold when you got superpowers. But then I remembered Captain America's story. And the most courageous thing about Captain America is not all the stuff he did as Captain America. The bravest thing Captain America did was to become Captain America. If you know Captain America's story, Captain America was a frail, skinny teenager whose mom and dad had both died. And he wanted to join the army in World War II to fight the Nazis, which enlisting in the army as a frail, skinny teenager is a pretty brave thing in and of itself. But the Army didn't take him, failed his physical. And then they approached him and asked him if he wanted to be part of their experiment taking super soldier serum. And he said yes. And the serum maxed out his physiology to the utmost of human potential, and he became Captain America. So his real courage, the real bravery, was in choosing to try the serum and becoming Captain America in the first place. Not all the deeds and adventures he did once he became that super embodiment of a soldier in the country and all that. Real courage is when you don't have superpowers. Maybe you can only show courage, you can only be brave when you don't feel very super at all. In my lifetime, there's a good handful of incredibly courageous, random acts of bravery that stick with me. One is Tank Man. Tank Man is the guy holding 2 plastic grocery bags standing in front of a line of tanks in Tiananmen Square in June 1989 as the Chinese government broke up pro-democracy rallies. It's a really well-known image of this one guy right in front of a column of tanks. No one still knows who he is, still unidentified. A video surfaced a number of years later of the tanks rolling down one of the streets approaching the square. And the video focuses on this guy on a bicycle riding down the street. But on the other side of the road, and a little further away, is that guy who ends up in front of the tanks. He's walking with grocery bags. And you can see him look up and see the tanks, and he starts to jog. My guess, the video ends there, my guess is he jogs over to the place where he met the tanks and stood in front of them. I can imagine he must have been fairly scared. But something made him go stand in front of the tanks. One of my other favorite random acts of bravery in my lifetime is Vedran Smilovic, the cellist of Sarajevo. After a bombing took out people waiting in a bread line during the siege of Sarajevo in the Bosnian War in 1992, Smilovic did the only thing a musician could to wage peace against war. He took a plastic folding chair and he set it up in ruins with sniper fire and other urban warfare going on around him. And he played Albinoni's Adagio in G minor. For days he'd set it up. He'd play at funerals that were dangerous to be at. Armed only with a cello in the middle of an urban war zone. Kashia Thomas is an 18-year-old African-American woman who in June 1996, during a clash between KKK marchers holding a rally in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and people protesting the KKK, placed herself between the crowd and a middle-aged white guy wearing a t-shirt with the Confederate flag. That poor guy had ended up with the protesters instead of with the KKK people, and the nonviolent protesters turned violent and started hitting him with the signs and kicking him. And Kashia Thomas threw her body in front of his and protected him and got them to stop. For a guy who probably would not have done the same for her. I think for the rest of my life, like many people, random act of bravery that will always impress me is the first responders who went up the Twin Towers as they were coming down. These are acts of bravery and random acts of courage you may have noticed. I bet we can all probably name a few similar that have caught our attention. And here's some examples of random acts of bravery you may not have heard of, although I bet also you may have similar stories that have caught your attention. My friend Andy, He got up each day in a bed and got into a motorized wheelchair, used a machine to help him breathe, had attendants to lift him onto and off of the toilet and wipe him when he needed it. Every day knowing he wouldn't live all that long with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. A daily, random act of bravery. My friends Michelle and Richard, who are both now, each of them, into their third decade of sobriety. Each day, one at a time, requires a courage from them that most people don't have to use. My mom, turning on her heels, grabbing my brother and I by the hand and walking out of a Catholic church at communion time after the priest refused to serve her communion for being divorced. One of the many ways my mom displayed random acts of bravery as a single mom with two boys growing up in the 70s and 80s. My stepmom, who each day for over 5 years did nothing basically but care for my dad with Alzheimer's. None of these people, Vedran Smilovich or Kashia Thomas or Andy or my mom, would tell you they are particularly brave. They just did what they had to do at the time. That's what one of our readings says. Courage is when you find that something in you that helps you do what you need to do at the time. Their stories are not unlike ours. Everyday people who found themselves in circumstances that invited them, if not demanded them, to overcome fear and being uncomfortable and anxiety. You probably don't think that you're extraordinarily brave, but I'm convinced all of us are more courageous than we're aware of. I have observed a lot of courage in my time here in this congregation. I've watched some of you face down cancer, deal with multiple deaths in your family, combat unemployment and underemployment. There's a bunch of you figuring out how to be caregivers for family members with Alzheimer's and dementia. I bet you would recognize my stepmom. I've observed you go into the community and feed our neighbors and do the internal work and learning required to make this a radically welcoming congregation. Courage is a daily practice for many of us, but I think sometimes we just don't see it. Just getting out of bed in the morning for some people requires a random act of bravery every day. For those dealing with depression or post-traumatic stress, getting out of bed is as brave as walking up the Twin Towers as they came down. The daily practice of parenting requires courage. There's no science and manual on raising children. Parenting is an art form, and it takes guts to step into it every day. The first visit to a 12-step program, or a counselor, or a therapist is one of the bravest acts an individual ever commits. We may be unaware we're being brave. We just feel scared or anxious or nervous. But we can be more aware of our own courage and bravery because it is indeed a practice. There are some things we can intentionally do to both be more courageous and recognize and be aware of our own bravery. Learn something new. Any new skill, new experience brings with it upfront uncertainty, anxieties, and even fear. Every time we risk something new, we practice courage. We can try our best to let go of past pain and hurt and anger and resentment. Every time we can put these things down, we are letting go of what's usually a coping mechanism. And that requires us to practice courage, to try dealing with something in a new way. We can do our best to live with integrity. We can be who we say we are. We can apologize and accept apologies. We can speak up on behalf of our values. We can be our authentic self. We can live wholeheartedly and open-heartedly. And we can be vulnerable. Be okay with letting others see your imperfections. Don't hide your learning edges. This is perhaps the most important thing we can do to consciously practice courage. Be okay with the vulnerability of being our real selves. One of my favorite people, you know her, Brene Brown, says, I always ask very simple questions to people. I say, think of the last time you did something you thought was really brave, or the last time you saw someone do something really brave. And I can tell you as a researcher, 11,000 pieces of data, I cannot find a single example of courage, of moral courage, spiritual courage, leadership courage, relational courage. I cannot find a single example of any type of courage that was not born completely and totally of vulnerability. We buy into some mythology about vulnerability being weakness and gullibility and frailty because it gives us permission to not do it. Giving into fear is natural and easy, but courage is more common than we think. Courage is a practice. It is not a piece of magic. Rita Dove tells us in the reading, courage has nothing to do with our intending to be great or bold. It has to do with what we decide in the moment when we're called upon to be more than we expected, more than we thought we'd have to. We can't decide to be more in any given moment unless we've been practicing doing that in other moments. Like all virtues, courage is learned by practice. People learn to behave in ways that seem fearless even though they are still scared. Every time we act bravely, we become more courageous, and we are more likely to act courageously the next time. I'm able to walk into an intensive care unit and know I will be okay with a family and a patient because I've been scared among hospitals and death over and over. And I had to learn how to watch my friend Andy die slowly. I had to put him on and off the toilet and wipe his butt. The ICU doesn't scare me anymore. Not in an upfront way. I always get the butterflies. But I've done it enough that I can put that over here and do what I gotta do. I was able to get over my nerves and go to the Occupy the Port of Houston and Black Lives Matter marches in Texas because even though I was very uncomfortable being the only white American student at the International Students Union in college, I still showed up for the meetings and learned what it was like to be other. And then when I don't feel like getting to the protest, or I'm too anxious about what it will feel like to be the white guy in that situation, I get up and go anyway. Not because I'm fearless, not because I got something other people don't have, but because over time I've practiced doing that. I've learned to manage my anxieties with it. I'm able to go into some difficult situations because when I worked at Amnesty International's office in Boston, I went to work for months under a bomb threat because of their positions on human rights issues. So in Texas, when people called and threatened my church because we accepted gay people, did it scare me? Yeah. Was I able to go do it anyway? Yeah. In his recent book, Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance talks about how the Marine Corps helped him become brave and courageous. And it wasn't about war. It was about the daily things the Marine Corps forced him to do. Get up early. Run the extra mile. Accept no excuses from himself, even when he wanted to. To do things even then when he was scared. And then when he got out of the Marine Corps, tackling challenges of being an adult like Getting his own place, getting his own job, taking care of himself, putting himself through school, didn't faze him anymore. Was he still scared and bothered by some of it? Sure. But he knew he'd be able to do it because he faced the fears before. Some of the most brazenly fearless and foolhardy people end up causing themselves and others more harm than good. Most of the time, people who seem fearless and want us to think they're fearless really are not fearless. And sometimes, the people who practice the real courage learn to practice being brave and learn to manage their fear and anxieties in smaller ways and places we never saw, until they were able to drag their plastic chair and cello into a war zone and play. Erica Young reminds us in the reading this morning that everything she ever did was about overcoming fear, constant practice of courage. In the preaching business, we call what Erica Young is talking about in the reading the going back to Pharaoh response, right? If you know the story of the Israelites in Egypt, they were out there wandering around the desert and they're hungry and they can't find food and they don't have shelter. And all of a sudden they start asking Moses, hey, can we go back to Pharaoh in Egypt? At least we knew what we had there. Sometimes people would rather go back to slavery than face the fear of the unknown. All instances of courage, from the famous to the obvious to the personal and unwitnessed, do not come out of nowhere. Somewhere inside someone, faith, a value system, a self-confidence is quietly there, having been developed over a lifetime of practice, maybe even when they weren't aware of it. A lifetime of practice of acting courageously, of showing up, getting something done even though you were scared or anxious or frightened. And this practice of courage is incredibly important because our world is full of fearless and foolhardy people who want us to think they're brave, but they're only covering up their own cowardice. Sometimes we are these people. Practicing courage is important because we can't create peaceful lives in a peaceful world out of fear. As Rogue One reminded us, rebellions are born of hope. So today, we'll offer each one of you the opportunity to be brave. And I encourage you to practice courageously.